Hi everyone. This month I'm talking to Liam Smith. Hi Liam.
Hi Jeff, how are you?
I'm well. We're going to talk about nature positive. What is nature positive?
I guess it's a fairly recent term, but it's an idea that's been around quite a long time. It works in this idea. It's essentially the idea that uh, we can do things that have a net benefit to nature. That benefit could be in many forms, like increasing habitat or improving environmental quality. But we can do those things that have a net positive against a measurable baseline. So there's a measurable baseline, and then we as humans or companies or organisations or governments can do things that we say actually that's good for nature.
Right.
It's not going to do more harm to nature. We think it's going to do good. So that's the broad idea of nature positive. It really got a lot of traction with a fairly recent conference of the parties in Kunming, Montreal, in Canada. And the idea of nature positive really came out there as something we needed to do. We need to understand what nature is and how we measure it, and then what we can do to improve it. And that's sort of how it's got traction, and that's sort of translated. I mean, some of the things that have happened subsequently to that is countries have gone and enacted things. In Australia, we've got a new policy called the Nature Positive Plan that looks at introducing new rules and regulations, as well as nature repair markets, so markets that help trade essentially to try and I'm going to fix my creek, so I get some credits.
Okay.
And that has value. Companies are reporting on what they are doing for nature, the damage they're causing, what they're doing to prevent that, and also try and improve nature. So there's a bit of a movement around the world that's sort of built off that agreement.
Right.
So we've been bold. We've also committed to 30 by 30, which is this idea that we will protect by 2030. We will protect 30% of our land and oceans in order to preserve biodiversity or prevent biodiversity loss. Of course, Australia has a terrible record. There are lots of threats. Climate change is certainly one of them, but probably in Australia, the biggest one is deforestation. So, or land clearing actually is probably a better way of putting it. That's the biggest one, but pollution, invasive species. There are a bunch of threats that are there. People are often surprised to hear in Australia we lose one, as in a species goes extinct every 2 years. Like the things that cute, cuddly things that we ought to care a lot about, and when all those threats come in, it really suffers quite badly, and we end up in this situation.
Right. Changing and repairing nature means that we're going to have to change our behaviours. What does this mean from a behaviour point of view?
We've had policies in the past, and so I think these policy interventions are important, and they can help, and they can set tone and direction. But actually, we need people. Behavioural science really hasn't been much in the conversation today. It's fairly new. That I sit on the Biodiversity Council, and they deliberately wanted me part of that council because they're thinking what we've done for the last 200 years, broadly speaking, but even the last 20 years, manifestly hasn't worked.
What sort of techniques do behavioural scientists have at their disposal? This is not just a Clean Up Australia Day campaign once a year on a Sunday to make you feel good. This is a much bigger thing.
Yeah, look, you're spot on. And we've been thinking a lot. And I think there's a bit of evidence to show when you paint some really big problems that are big, hairy and complex, like nature, people can feel a little bit helpless.
Yeah.
We want to give them some, what can I do in my everyday life that might make a bit of a difference? What are those things that we can do?
Right.
What are those behaviours that we could do to help halt biodiversity loss here in Australia? And so a couple of projects in particular, one led by Matt Zielinski at RMIT, really tried to focus in on what are the things that the average person can do, and used a tool called an impact likelihood matrix, something that Sarah Kneebone from our team designed probably 8 or 9 years ago now, and used that approach to really arrive at some specific behaviours. And they're things like wildlife gardening and keeping your cat contained, and some of your purchases that you make, in particular, fair trade or these sorts of things, like encouraging people to do those things. And eating, in fact, another one that came up with Matt's work was around eating less red meat, which is another one, of course, that can drive climate change, but also particularly problematic in Australia, the land clearing.
Right.
So those are some things that everyone can do. There's another, sorry.
And they can be packaged as a kind of meat-free Monday or something. So it doesn't have to be cold turkey, so to speak. It's gradual changes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so yeah, times that by 25 million, whatever the population of Australia, you really can make a difference in the behaviour itself, but you can also send signals to markets, right? So if all of a sudden we see a sharp uptick in the purchase of, MSC, Marine Stewardship Council seafood products, then the market sees that, right? And they go, oh, okay, we need to provide more of those. There's a demand for it, and the markets will respond to that sort of stimulus.
Yeah.
The other category of behaviour that I think is really interesting, and it's a separate piece of work, was advocacy. So providing policy support. So it's giving politicians and saying to politicians or voting and saying, we want progressive biodiversity policy.
Right.
And we know, that's probably a bit of a no-brainer, but that comes out. The experts say there's one thing you can do is to really support biodiversity policy as you can, whether it's the ballot box or whether that's through donations or whether that's through, a rally or whatever it happens to be.
It's a demonstration of this is what we want.
Yeah.
These are our values.
Yeah.
And it can happen once every 4 years at an election or all the time if it's donations that you make or stuff you share on social media.
Yep. Yeah, that's what the experts are telling us. Please advocate. And, 97% of people want, support action for nature.
Right.
Most people, they like spending time in a park. They like seeing native flora and fauna and interacting with it, and they see value in it. So it's not hard, it ought to be not such a huge step to translate that into some support.
So if it's something like keeping cats in, cat curfews, that is a social norm change, isn't it? It's a way of going, my pets, I love them, but they can be a danger to the rest of the environment. It's up to me to do that. Assuming, of course, that there won't be cat patrols out at 2 a.m. at night. It really is a kind of a personal choice to say, this thing that gives me so much pleasure, I have to control.
Yeah. So how do we persuade people? Some interesting work was done by Melbourne Zoo around this, and they came up with a campaign called Safe Cats, Safe Wildlife. And one of the central arguments that they thought had a lot of traction, and I'll tie this back to behavioural science in a minute, was if you keep your cat in at night, it's safer. Chances are it will live a longer life. It's less likely to get run over by vehicles or get into fights with other cats and cause, issues. Now, how did they arrive at that argument? That's kind of the question, which is the behavioural science question, which sort of fills in that gap between the bit about what behaviour do we want people to do, which we talked about already, and then how do I get people to do that behaviour?
Right.
And that's part of the art of behavioural science. In the BehaviourWorks method model, we call that the deep dive. It's about trying to talk to people and get inside their heads to work out, why do you keep your cat in at night? Why don't you? And then testing some different arguments to see how persuasive they are. And we've done similar things. Years ago, I did a campaign with Perth Zoo around the purchase of recycled toilet paper, recycling by an FSC, type behaviour, which they thought was really important. Again, targeting that key issue in Australia of deforestation and land clearing, and we did some research to try and work out why would people buy recycled toilet paper? Why wouldn't they buy recycled toilet paper? And we came up with three things. One, they don't buy recycled toilet paper because it's rough,
right?
Because it's weak,
yes,
and because it's more expensive,
right?
And so that's that's behavioural science in action, right? So it's about, why do people not do that behaviour, or why do they do it?
Yeah.
Let's understand the differences. Let's work out what some of those key messages might be.
Yeah.
Let's turn that into something that's engaging, that captures and holds someone's attention long enough to sort of deliver a persuasive message, if it's persuasion that's your tool.
Yeah.
And then put it into field and see if it works. And that mostly worked, that campaign. There's some caveats around it, but I won't go into them now.
So in the end, nature positive is a different way of looking at the way we treat the world and the impact we have on nature. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and Australia's learning to play its part as well. And anyone can take part in this. You don't have to be a land owner per se. All of us can contribute to this.
The only thing I'll probably add to that is There are some particular audiences that have a bigger stake here. I think you mentioned landowners.
Yeah.
We know the biggest issue is land clearing in Australia. What's probably the biggest issue in Australia for biodiversity, and that particular one is they're a target audience, as we would call it. We really want to lean into. We need to understand that the nature repair markets were designed for them. Yes, we all can participate.
Yeah.
But there's probably just 2 or 3 really important audiences we also need to pay extra attention to.
Right. Liam Smith, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Cheers.